So I'm kind of super excited about this talk because it's a sort of first outing for a new thing. So hopefully it won't turn out to be a total train wreck. But it's also new, but also kind of old. When I was little, like 6 or 7 years ago, a lot of my research was about biological convergences. So these cases in the history of life where we get very similar traits emerging in quite different lineages. Think of bats and birds having wings, or ichthyosaurs, dolphins and sharks having a fusiform shape. And in that work I was kind of really thinking about the way in which those convergences can evidence adaptive hypotheses about the relationship between particular niches and environments and particular traits. And so I was really thinking about convergence in a very local kind of way. Convergence can tell us about very particular kinds of things. At the same time, a lot more people were thinking about convergence in terms of a much bigger sort of question. They were thinking about the roles that convergence can play in telling us about something like the shape of life. Right? Something like, what is the robustness or fragility of evolutionary outcomes at a kind of grand macroevolutionary scale? A lot of this, of course, comes out of Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life, which is kind of a beautiful example of how a scientist, in this case a paleontologist, can really get into some pretty deep philosophical ideas in a way that gives us philosophers years and years and years of work trying to work out precisely what he meant by what he said. I'm less interested in trying to figure out what Gould meant. I'm more interested in just engaging in this debate. Gould's basic view is something like this: evolutionary outcomes are extremely contingent. There's a whole bunch of events that the outcomes massively depend upon. Had those events gone differently, we'd end up with very different outcomes. So the existence of humans seems to depend massively on events that happened, say, 500 million years ago. This is the sort of idea. What I'm going to do today is roughly two things. First, I'm going to sketch this new project I'm doing where I'm picking up the thinking about convergences again. I'm going to explain what I'm going to call comparative thinking, which should be pretty familiar to anyone who's ever talked to a biologist, at least that's my hope, which is talking about the way that biologists use comparative evidence, that is evidence that involves comparing different taxa or species. And I'm going to argue that evidence in that context is very, very local, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm then going to look at recent discussion of macroevolutionary contingency, the stuff following on from what Gould had to say, and I'm going to make a few conceptual moves. First, I'm going to try and enrich the way people think about macroevolutionary possibility. I'm going to give us some more concepts to play with. And I'm going to get a bit clearer, I think, on what's at stake in the debate. I think a lot of people have mischaracterized what at least the scientists involved in the debate are interested in. Then I'm going to basically conclude that the way in which convergence can count as evidence for these macroevolutionary hypotheses is extremely limited. They can tell us stuff about pretty constrained areas of biological possibility, as it were, but they can't tell us anything kind of more grand. So that's the scheme. So, the way I'm going to talk to you about comparative thinking is basically just with some very sort of hopefully simple case studies, which are going to involve some audience participation, and know how much philosophers enjoy that. So this is a cat skull. Cat, right? One thing you should notice about the cat skull is this little gap right here, right? The molars don't go all the way to the incisor. It's pretty obvious, all right? Here's another cat skull. This is Smilodon, the North American saber-toothed lion. Notice, gap, all right? Here's a wolf skull. Notice, not much of a gap there, right? The molars just continue along to the end. Anyone want to guess what that is? Oh, very close to badger. Badger. Again, all the way across. Okay, so, do you think this is a cat or not a cat? It's the only time you have to do it. Yeah, it's a cat, because it's got this big gap here, right? Cats have a very, very distinctive morphology. Why? Well, the reason they have this morphology is that cats have an extremely distinctive killing method. What big cats and little cats do when they kill is what's called a throat clamp. You basically go and strangle, right? This is how big cats are able to take down quite large animals. And the gap is basically there to help get a little, get that space around the neck so you can give it some good squishing. So cats have a very, very distinctive method of killing, and this is tracked by their morphology. This is a kind of example of a very typical way of thinking about mammals. Mammals are very fancy, not because of our big brains, or because of our milk, or because of our hair. It's because we can do this. Birds can't do that, reptiles can't do that. These things are rubbish. Mammals are extremely well-adapted chewers. And you can tell a lot about mammals from their teeth and from their jaw musculature. Okay, so this is kind of hard to see, but this is a sort of graph comparing two different dimensions of how you might vary the shape of a skull. So on this dimension you've got kind of going from quite a wide skull to quite a thin skull, and on this one you're kind of stretching the skull out as you go along. Scattered on this are a bunch of critters, right, a bunch of different lineages. The ones that are sort of figures, right, so that's a little dog there, represent placental mammals. The ones that are letters, really hard to see, there's a D there, represent marsupials. Here, you've got a big cluster of dogs. This is dog skull-shaped space. Here, you've got a big cluster of cats and a couple of bears. This is cat skull-shaped space. If you were actually able to see this, one thing you would immediately notice is that there are lots of letters, that is marsupial mammals, in dog space, but there are no letters in cat space. It looks like marsupials have converged on a kind of dull dog skull shape about 4 times, but they've never made it into cat space, right? So if you want to know why cats are better than dogs, is that cats are distinctive and unique. Whereas dogs, dime a dozen. So, how to get half the audience to no longer like you. So why? Why do marsupials never get there? Well, here are two sort of hypotheses. One is marsupials, of course, are born extremely undeveloped and have to get to the pouch, right? So marsupials just spend half their gestation time in the pouch rather than the womb. And the way they get to the pouch is by kind of using their jaw to climb up mum, right? That means that their jaw has to be super well developed really, really early on. If they've got a sort of crappy, not properly developed jaw, they're not going to be able to get up to the pouch. It might be that that need to have a well-developed jaw early on means that they're really constrained in what types of tooth morphology they can have. Second hypothesis, when you're a placental mammal like us, our molars have many different eruption points. We have like 3 or 4. Our molars just grow at different places. Marsupial mammals have just one eruption point. You basically go molar, and it goes along like a conveyor belt molar, right? It seems like if you have many different eruption points, then you've got more capacity to change that morphology in the molars. If you've only got one, then you can just produce the same type of molar. So both of these hypotheses, the latter one seems to be more popular, but no one knows at this point, are examples of how you can use kind of developmental thinking, thinking about the constraints on development, to try and explain the sort of patterns we see in life's shape. So this is a kind of illustration of what I'm going to call comparative thinking, which is this very classic kind of Darwinian way of conceiving of lineages and taxa, right? You're thinking of lineages as being shaped by ancestry and adaptation, right? This should be unsurprising to anyone. But I think when we start looking at, in these comparative contexts, the way in which people think about lineages as being shaped by ancestry and adaptation, we start to learn a bit about how some biologists think. One thing to note is that this way of thinking is fundamentally integrative, right? Often when people talk about, evolutionary developmental biology versus, population genetics and things like that, they try and make them quite autonomous of one another. They say, well, the explanations are independent in some important respect. I think in these contexts that just doesn't seem to hold. These things look like they're just fundamentally integrated at some important level. Also, the way in which these lineages fit into these comparative contexts looks like it's fundamentally research guiding. What makes the way in which marsupial mammals develop as opposed to placental mammals important is this interesting comparative question we had about why is it marsupials haven't found themselves in cat skull space, right? So I think this way of situating your critters in these comparative contexts does a lot of sort of research guiding and significance generating work for biologists. Finally, I think it sort of shows that biologists often categorize in extremely local sorts of ways. Most of the work on biological categorization is thinking about these, categories like species and phyla and so on and so forth, and sure, they use those categories, but we've just seen an example of biologists using a category called dog skull space, right? That's a category they use, they're not very worried about it, and it looks like it's local and it's importantly paraphyletic. It's not just relating on sort of monophyletic categories. And so I think this is an interesting way of thinking about a whole bunch of stuff. So lots more to say about that stuff. Let's think about comparative evidence. So as I said at the start, when I'm thinking about comparative evidence, I'm thinking about it in this sort of very localized kind of way. So I'm going to quickly sketch two sorts of paradigm inferences that are made in comparative biology, and I'm going to use that to illustrate this localness. Again, this should be pretty familiar to anyone. So here are the three representative cats we've got. We have house cat, tiger, Smilodon, right? These folks have a common ancestor. We're able to infer from their similarities, both to there being a common ancestor, but also to properties that common ancestor has. For instance, pretty sure the common ancestor of these critters is going to have a gap between its molars and its incisors. Given that we know, given that we know that the common ancestor has these features, I'm also going to be able to make inferences from the common ancestor to features we don't know about other critters. For instance, I can probably tell a lot about the way that Smilodon went about its business, even though it's extinct, in virtue of looking at tigers and house cats. Right, so this is an example of what you might call a phylogenetic inference, where we have an unknown trait and some target lineage, and we infer it from known traits and source lineages on the basis of them sharing a common ancestor. It's kind of a two-step inference, right? You go from current critter you're looking at to the common ancestor, and then to the related critter. Pretty common kind of inference. But you might point out that, the striking saber-teeth quality, it's not just seen in cats, right? Here we've got, this is some kind of gorgonosaurid, which is a synapsid, which is this lineage of critters back in the Permian, so before the dinosaur times. There were these other reptile-y kind of critters, Dimetrodon is one, and they ended up developing into the humans and other mammals, right? They were very, very successful for a long time, longer than placental mammals have been successful, and they, lo and behold, had these fancy teeth. And this is Thylicus milis, which is a marsupial saber-toothed critter. Goes to figure. So what can we do with this sort of comparison? Well, it seems like the patterns that we might find relating that saber teeth, the function of the saber tooth, to particular environments might tell us something about the relationship between that trait and other traits, or the relationship between that trait and particular environments. So for instance, in these fellas, in the synapsids, they've evolved saber teeth about 4 times or so, and each time it's only after they've shifted from a snapping bite to a press and hold bite. Right? Once you have a press and hold bite, you start seeing saber teeth evolving, which suggests that there's an important adaptive relationship somehow between having this particular type of biting method, the press and hold, and saber teeth. Right? And so I might infer from something having saber teeth to it having this press and hold kind of biting method. Right? So here I'm just building up an adaptive model. I'm using these as data points, and then I'm using that to infer to some critter. Right? So a convergent inference. Source lineages, they give you evidence of some adaptive model, which is either tracking trait to environment, or in the case I've just seen, trait to trait, and that's then applied to the target lineage. Cool. Okay, so that's 2 paradigm examples of comparative inferences. Obviously, in these cases we've looked at earlier, they're highly integrative, so people are doing these inferences at the same time. But I think the evidence here is what I'm going to call situated, sensitive, and specific, because alliteration is important. What I mean by situated, well, the comparisons pretty much always, so far as I can tell, depend on phylogenetic context, right? There are other saber teeth that aren't synapsids. There are fish with great big saber teeth. Without other independent reasons to think about it, biologists would be very suspicious of attaching the press and hold bite as an explanation for why that fish has that great big tooth, right? At least most of the time. The legitimacy of the comparisons is also pretty highly sensitive to description. So I said earlier that cats are cool because they're unique. What I meant by that was they're unique because of this throat clamp kind of method of killing and because of this molar reduction, right? They're unique in terms of those traits. If we made the claim slightly more coarse-grained, and I made a claim about maybe them having carnivore or vertebrate-style dentistry, or them having, what's the other one I got there? A particular hunting technique, then suddenly the comparison become illegitimate, right? So it's really sensitive to how you describe the trait or environment at hand. Related to that, they're specific to the particular comparisons. What I can infer between is often really, really specific, right? So for instance, the inference that takes me from cat-like jaw to cat-like killing technique seems okay, but cat-like jaw to cat-like hunting technique, not okay, because, well, cats hunt in many different ways. And so they're very, very specific. The lesson I kind of take from this is that comparative evidence can do a lot of work in establishing kind of relatively local accounts of the way that lineages are shaped by ancestry and adaptation. Okay, so what does that have to do with this big question about the shape of life, right? Let's run through some things what some scientists have said. So Stephen Jay Gould, of course, comes out in 1989? 1980? I have no idea when that was published. A long time ago. And it says 1989. He comes out and says, hey look, life is highly contingent. Someone called me Morris, another paleontologist, comes back and says kind of roughly the opposite. He says, no, actually life's outcomes are highly robust. If we were to visit other planets, we're probably not going to find life. It's his first claim. He thinks, at least, he doesn't think this now, but in 2002, he thought that life turning up was highly fragile, very unlikely to happen. But he thought that life, once it has turned up, is going to fulfill a pretty standard pattern. And the pattern, to be only slightly unfair to Conway Morris, is something like the Star Trek hypothesis. You know, in Star Trek you go to other planets and everyone is bipedal and they have two eyes that face this way and they're sentient, they just might be slightly different coloured or have some crap on their forehead, right? He pretty much thinks that is what it's going to be like. He thinks that life is somehow directed towards human-y-like things, right? If you think that's crazy, he claimed it. The argument for this is, hey, look at all the convergence, right? So this is where convergence sort of gets put on the table as an important kind of evidence. So this book, it's really, really a great read, just lists a whole bunch of different convergences and goes, hey, look, if life was contingent the way Gould thinks, then surely we wouldn't expect to see this much convergence. There's a bunch of problems with Conway Morris's argument. I think the most direct one is he doesn't distinguish between convergences which are constrained by development and convergences which are much more general. Gould's perfectly fine with the idea that you're going to get lots of repeated patterns within quite constrained contexts. It's the idea that you're going to get these sort of repeated patterns across all life that he's not so happy with. Someone who does a bit better than Conway Morris is George Mcgee, who's a sort of comparative morphologist, sort of. Again, this book is a great big list of convergences where what he's trying to do is argue that we can understand life's shape and life's the sort of possibility at the macro scale. But here he at least is using a bit of the developmental constraint versus functional constraint kind of thinking. But again, there's this idea that convergence can answer big questions. The most recent scientist to weigh in on this is Jonathan Losos, who is very much against the importance of convergence. Losos is a really interesting scientist who does a lot of experimental evolution. So basically, you get some critters that breed really fast, and you put them in a bottle, and you get them to breed real fast, and see how they evolve, right? Losos says, hey, look, we don't need to look at convergences, we can do sort of real experiments. Here's him complaining about the role of convergences. He says, we could argue these points back and forth until we're blue in the face. I'd throw out the platypus, you'd counter with convergent hedgehogs, I'd postulate the unique algae-crusted upside-down hanging tree sloth, you'd retort with bipedal hopping mice independently evolved on 3 continents, and that is how essentially the controversy has been debated historically by compelling lists and telling stories. This is some classic scientist rhetoric, right? It's the people who I don't like are just storytelling. I think we can immediately see one thing based on the sort of picture of comparative thinking is that this is too quick, right? You're not just giving a list of convergences, you're also putting them into a comparative context. And I think that's an important difference. I do think Losos has got an interesting stuff to say about the role of experimental evolution in probing these questions, but I do think there's a sort of big objection that he doesn't seem to be very sensitive to, which is just like scale, y'all. Like, I agreed with Losos that what I can get some E. coli to do in very controlled conditions count as evolution, no doubt. But like, not all evolution's the same, and you might think that the sort of 100 million years of cat evolution is not necessarily going to behave in the same way as 5 years of E. coli evolution. I think there are some really interesting problems with validity. Not that I think that it's useless. Okay, so that's what sort of the scientists have said recently. Let's think about what some philosophers have said. So in a recent paper, what order is it in? Yeah, Russell Powell and Carlos Mariscal do a really nice job, I think, of thinking about how convergence could evidence macroevolutionary stuff. And so I'm going to use them as a kind of foil to sort of see where I think I'm going to be a bit more pessimistic than them. So what they're doing is they're to kind of compare two different types of outcome. One is the kind of Gouldy outcome, which is radically contingent, and the other one is the sort of Conway-Morrissey outcome, when it's radically convergent, or robustly convergent. So they say that something's going to be radically contingent when its existence depends on events occurring during a given evolutionary past that are unlikely to be replicated across the vast majority of alternative evolutionary histories. So you survey all the possible evolutionary histories and you count how many times the thing happens. And that's going to decide whether or not it's robust or not. Quick sketch of, I've kind of already gone through this, but just quick sketch about why we're thinking about convergence here. Big problem with telling between these two things when you're thinking about the macro scale. All the life we know is from that thing, and so far as we know, all the life comes from a single source, which means that we have this much evidence. Right? It's Kimsteronian's called the n equals 1 problem. If all life comes from one source and convergent evidence has to be independent, then this doesn't tell us anything about life on other planets. Right? The attempted solution is maybe there are ways we can look at convergences and maybe singletons, and maybe that can answer these questions. But the problem is that convergences are underdetermined, right? Are the convergences due to a highly constrained developmental context, or are they true convergences? So what Powell and Mariscal try and do is pick out a bunch of cases, or a set of cases, that they think really do evidence this question. They look at ones that are first obtaining across many conditions, so they're not sort of sensitive to very particular times or places. Second, they're using different inherited developmental resources, so you've got things that are widely different phylogenetically. And third, that are sort of less abstract in characterization. They mean by that like something like insulation, quite abstract, blubber, not very abstract, right? So if we found blubber obtaining across many different times and places in critters that have got very different developmental resources, then I might say that the evolution of blubber is robustly replicable. It's a convergent outcome. Okay, so let's make some conceptual moves. How am I doing for time?
You have 8 minutes.
Cool.
Plus 10.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so notice this term unlikely. I got a bit confused about this idea that what I'm doing is I'm counting repetitions across possibility, but somehow that's connected to likelihood, because those things be different, right? Probability and possibility, I think, are quite different concepts, right? Possibility is, in a sense, sort of flat, right? There's all the things what are possible. Okay, here they all are. But it doesn't tell me anything about the relationships between those things that are possible, nor does it tell me which are more or less probable, nor does it tell me which are more or less likely. And so I think just claiming that we should look, this sort of idea that I can easily think about probability as being roughly the same as replication across possibilities is, I think, pretty problematic. Some people do give accounts of probability that do track something like this, but so far as I can tell, it's pretty standard for people to think about probability as being separate from possibility. Sometimes people talk about spreading mud across the possibilities. How much mud there is the probability that's attaching to them all. I didn't quite get it either, but there you go. Here's a way of sort of illustrating this point and enriching the way we think about evolutionary possibility, and this is coming to an extent from George Mcgee's work. So Mcgee's a theoretical morphologist, and he likes to construct morphospaces. Here's kind of, I think, probably the first morphospace, which is David Raup's shell model. What Raup's done is basically got a little computer model, given it 3 different dimensions, and built a whole bunch of shells. Right? So you just 3 different rules of how to grow shells. That gives you a space of possible shells. What you can then do is plot the actual shells within that morphospace. So the shaded in area is where the real shells are. Possible shells, real shells. Right? So we have a a theoretical morphospace telling us what's possible, and we have an actual empirical morphospace. Now, Raup doesn't really care about this just because he's interested in what's possible and what's actual. The point of doing this, in a way, is it starts to let you ask questions like, how come that stuff be filled in? How come that stuff not be filled in? This is a really interesting way of asking macroevolutionary questions about why life is shaped in that particular way. Other stuff you might want to know, for instance, is the likelihood, right? What are the probability distributions across that? Just because something is occupying the actuality space, that doesn't mean that it's probable. And just because something isn't in an actuality space, that doesn't mean that it's improbable, right? Those things come apart. We also might want to know about the it's called the topography, right? What are the relationships between the different traits in the landscape? How am I able to move through that landscape? What are the various dependencies that structure that topography, right? Those are things we want to know about the shape of life. So, if I'm talking about macroevolutionary possibility or these sort of big Gouldian questions, I'm not really just interested in the possible and the actual, and convergence is going to tell me different things in these different contexts. For instance, establishing a trait's possibility. So if it's an actual trait, that's easy, because actuality and possibility, right? But impossibility is pretty hard, right? Just because something is an actual doesn't mean that it's impossible. And given that, again, the n=1 problem, we're only looking at one evolution of life, if I'm thinking about impossibility, it's kind of plausible that there are going to be some interesting areas of morphospace that we just don't have access to. What about its probability? And by that I mean sort of probability to core. Gosh, I don't know, right? We're looking in this one highly constrained context. How am I supposed to know what the unconditional probability of any particular trait might be? What about likelihood? So the conditional probability. Yeah, sure, right? It seems like eyes have evolved on Earth roughly 40 times, if we describe what an eye is in a coarse-grained enough way. I'm pretty happy to say that the likelihood, if you've got a critter and there's some light and it's significantly similar enough to to things on Earth, then it's going to evolve some kind of light detecting mechanism. That seems pretty plausible. But notice that that's conditional probability, not just straight probability. What is it going to tell us about establishing these sort of paths through possibility space, like the topography of the space? Well, sometimes it's going to be great, right? But often in very, very sort of localized conditions. In the cases where we've got really good evidence of the way that constraint is working, the way that and the way that lineages are getting shaped, we've got pretty good story there. But there's so much of that space that's potentially invisible to us. There might not be, right? It might be that actual track's possible really, really well. How would we know that? Right? Seems like there's a whole bunch of uncertainty here, and convergence in this case just doesn't look like the right kind of evidence. Very close to finishing, but quick, second kind of conceptual point. Remember that the way that Powell and Mariscal go about distinguishing between the sort of radical contingency thesis versus the robust replicability thesis is in terms of rarity across possibility space. I don't think that's sufficient to track what the people in the debate are arguing about. For instance, Simon Conway Morris thinks that actually human-like things are going to be very rare across possibility space because he doesn't think the likelihood of life evolving is very high, right? So it's only when life evolves, which isn't very often, that you're going to get the human things, right? So actually, rarity is not quite catching it, right? In part, it sort of depends upon how we characterize the evolutionary possibility space. If we're including environments, and most of the people who are sort of pro-convergency people are what Peter Godfrey Smith has called externalists. They think that it's the environment that's doing most of the work and shaping the lineages. Then actually, if we've got rare environments, then they're going to say it's super contingent, right? So it's just not really tracking it. So a quick suggestion is I think that what's really going on is a claim about why we see the patterns we do, why things are rare when they're rare, and why things are common when they're common. I think contingency folk think that the rarity or otherwise of evolutionary outcomes depends upon fine-grained historical features. What does that mean? Well, by historical, I simply mean path-dependent, right? Contingent in some sort of respect. One way of thinking about it is I'm constrained in terms of which bit of morphospace I can get to, right? By fine-grained, I just mean, specific and highly detailed. Whereas the sort of Conway-Morris style folks think the outcome depends on these coarse-grained ahistorical features. By ahistorical, I mean something like I'm not very constrained about how I move around on morphospace, right? If an environment wants me to have wings, I will get wings, damn it, right? That's the sort of idea, right? I think that's really what the debate is turning on. And I think the convergence can actually give us some answers about when things depend on these different types of features. That's what people who are doing this kind of comparative methods are in the business of telling us. But again, it's super duper constrained, right? So the spread of convergence can tell us something about when outcomes are going to depend on fine-grained historical or coarse-grained ahistorical features, right, on Earth or given Earth-like biological systems. And so as I say, it's limited to quite local conditions, right? So I can probably do it real good with like saber teeth maybe, and I can do it really good with eyes. But eyes being robustly replicable doesn't tell me much about other evolutionary outcomes. Does that mean that legs are going to be robustly replicable? Well, I don't know. We'd have to go look, right? The basic problem is that questions of macroevolutionary contingence and convergence are about the shape of life generally, so the kind of question they're asking. But comparative evidence is super, super piecemeal. So it's just a strong disconnect between these two things. So I've argued that comparative lineages are highly localized. So the evidence that we get is highly localized. It's depending on this situating within ancestry and adaptation. But the debate has often been cast in terms of this very macroevolutionary, very general kind of idea. I think that's problematic. Multiple convergences can do some cool stuff for us, but I don't think they can do something like resolve the debate between someone like Gould and Comey-Morris. I think it's the wrong kind of evidence to do that sort of work. Some sort of open questions, assuming that, you know, of course I've convinced you all of all the things I've said. First, of course, I've just isolated convergences, right? And you're not really supposed to do that, modulo the last talk. We should be using all the available evidence that we have, right? And so there's an interesting question about how can I use things like experimental evolution and simulations and so on and so forth, along with convergences to kind of, you know, bootstrap my way up to the sort of big macroevolutionary questions. Another one is like the more I think about this sort of big question, the more skeptical I get of it being all that good a question to ask. So George Mcgee talks about it in terms of a total theoretical morphospace. When you're talking about the theoretical morphospace of shells and you've got 3 dimensions and that captures all the shells, I'm like, oh, cool, I get that, that's tractable. But total theoretical morphospace, what are the dimensions? Will there be infinite dimensions? My brain melts a bit when I think about the notion of total theoretical morphospace, and then melts even more when I think about the idea that we might get some sort of epistemic traction on what total theoretical morphospace might be like. So I worry a bit that, I'm not going to go so far as to say these are ill-formed, but I don't know, there are maybe more interesting questions we could ask. Finally, I worry that maybe I'm cheating in a certain way, right? So I've started by saying comparative evidence fundamentally turns on these issues of phylogeny. You need to pay a lot of attention to, you know, the ancestral context. But like, that's just like the opposite of what someone like Comey-Morris thinks, right? He thinks that that stuff is in some sense irrelevant. I think that one can provide lots of independent arguments to say that Comey-Morris has just made a mistake in the first instance by appealing to, you know, independent evidence about how important phylogenetic stuff is for how biologists do their work. But still, I feel like slightly uneasy. I feel like I might be loading the dice in a certain way, but I haven't quite put my finger on it, whether I'm doing it or not. And that's me.
Can you hear me better? Okay, I realized that the comments I prepared are quite tangential. I think I finally understood your topic better and your claims better. So I'm going to improvise some commentary now. Your basic claim seems to be that the thesis of convergence, which you construe as the final conditions of life on Earth, do not depend so sensitively on the initial conditions of life when it started, right? I mean, convergence means, according to the views that you criticize, that no matter which initial life forms there were, at the end, on our, Earth, we would end up with similar life structures. And you think that there's not much evidence for that. Even comparative evidence, comparing different lineage histories, would not yield any amount of evidence because we don't know the extent to which we need evidence to justify such a claim. I mean, the possibility space is so huge, we may have a very tiny bit of, evidence for convergence on some traits, but that's nothing compared with what could happen in the future, for instance. And at the moment, we don't see any convergence. I mean, convergence is not something we can observe to start with. It's a model claim saying that no matter from which initial conditions life could have started, it would have ended up it would have ended up to the situation we see now. So yeah, I think your point is quite well taken. I think the burden of proof is on people who do defend convergence, given that, you cannot even quantify the amount of evidence needed to establish such a thesis. Now, I was thinking to compare it with some theories in physics, like dynamic differential equations, Navier-Stokes equations for fluid dynamics, and so on and so forth, which are modeled by stochastic equations that sort of represent highly contingent starting points and may take as input various kinds of initial conditions, but you can prove a priori that eventually some such systems will converge, as they say in ergodic theory, there will be attractors, and the future histories of the systems will be attracted to that region of possibilities and will be constrained, with a very high probability, will be constrained within that region. So I think it may be interesting to compare those a priori claims about convergence in ergodic systems with claims of convergence that you had mentioned. That's one suggestion I have. Yeah. I would have questioned what exactly you mean by evidence being highly local, situated, sensitive, and specific. I may give you examples from other episodes in history of science, say in history of astronomy, Kepler computing the orbit of Mars or Earth. You would say similarly that the data he had was highly situated, sensitive, sensitive to our position from the Earth, and probably specific, even though I don't quite understand what you mean by specific. So that kind of comparison would clarify for people like me, who don't know so much about the theories that you're talking about, what exactly you mean by evidence being highly situated, sensitive, and specific. And other than that, I very much agree with you that cats are very distinguished and unique. And I also like your t-shirt. Thank you.
It was only on the walk up here that I realized I was wearing a cat t-shirt today. It wasn't. So can I show that?
Yeah, and I think I will moderate the rest of the...
So I totally buy the importance of thinking about stochastic modeling when we're thinking about macroevolution, and lots of scientists do this. So from the sort of mid-70s onwards, people started using it first quite simple and increasingly interesting sort of dynamic models to think about macroevolution. One thing that is always not so clear to me is what the relationship is between the kind of models that have these kinds of traction spaces and so on and so forth, and the sorts of complexities we're talking about when we're talking about things like having big teeth. I sort of worry that it might be a good way of metaphorically understanding what's going on, but I worry sometimes that what really matters is not so much this kind of quite theoretical way of understanding it, but often sort of material conditions kind of seem to matter more. Not that those are necessarily in tension. But I really like the question about what makes evidence highly local, because you're absolutely right, the data is always local. Right? Anytime I generate data that's in a particular context, and that context always matters to what I can do with that data. What I mean, one way to think about what I mean by locality is something about where the data can travel, right? What kinds of hypotheses or theories might the data be able to inform? And so often when people are talking about, that might turn out that actually all data is quite super local, but at least often when people talk about traditional experimental contexts, the claim is at least they're testing very, very general theories. So even though I've generated my experiment in these highly local conditions, that tests this really big theory. To be honest, I tend to be, I have sort of Cartwright kind of intuitions about that. I tend to be a bit suspicious, but one way of trying to think about what I mean by local is that the data can only be deployed in relatively constrained circumstances. It can only inform you about a sort of small range of pretty fine-grained things, as opposed to data which can be used much more generally than any one way of capturing it. But thank you, I really appreciate you jumping in.
Thank you. Any questions?
Hi, thanks for the talk. So that my question is going to be a general one. In terms of convergent evolution, what do you think about the likelihood of the emergence of properties that are associated with our species, considering the evolution of other extinct Homo species and even hominid species?
Great, so it's going to depend a little bit on what we're going to characterize as being particularly human. So if we think about human things being stuff like having relatively complicated, being like obligate cooperators and using tools and having pretty complicated social lives, then that has, turned up on Earth pretty often-ish, right? You've got your parity things, and you've got your cephalopods and so forth, right? That sort of complex cognition seems to have evolved in a range of quite different critters. But, I do think that there are certain things about the extent to which humans tend to do this stuff, right? The extent to which we're sort of cooperative, the extent to which our problem solving is sort of so abstracted often from the context in which we're doing it, and so on and so forth, right? These various things. I do tend to think that those look quite different, even if we want to say, quantitatively rather than qualitatively different than the animal stuff. And it doesn't look like that's turned up very often. And so I tend to like stories that say something like, humans actually pretty contingent. Humans depend on a pretty particular evolutionary cascade to kind of get there. Whereas things like complex cognition seems to be, you get relatively more common. But again, you could probably, I flip back and forth between the humans aren't special, the humans are special. But when I'm in a humans are special mood, I tend to think that it's actually a pretty kind of contingent evolutionary outcome.
Just follow up a little. As far as I know, there is recent data in paleontology that suggests that there's a kind of repetitive evolutionary patterns in the early Homo species. Do you think is this a problem in terms of the contingency of the human evolution?
Not necessarily. It's totally fine if it turns out that Neanderthal are like totally just as human as we are, right? Because that's only going back 800,000 years. It's certainly true that the sort of picture we've got of hominid evolution has got increasingly bushy recently. It's getting pretty ridiculous. It looks like there's just heaps of different human style things running about the place the whole time, which is interesting because it means that we should think of ourselves as the last remnants of this once rich taxa. We're like the last pathetic survivors. As long as what I mean by this outcome being contingent being depending on features that are specific to the hominid lineage as opposed to Homo sapiens, then I think it's still going to hold. But folks who want to say things like, imagine this 40 years ago, and I said, people became human in Europe 50,000 years ago when they started painting on cave walls. That's no longer going to hold. You're going to have to push the stuff back quite a lot further.
Vivek?
That's just a clarificatory question, I suppose, which might end up being rewording some things you said about the morphological space that you had, the very nice picture of the, could you show it again?
The shells?
So, yeah, so I'm interested in the axis of what are those other, so is that already answering the question in a sense that if you know the relevant features, then you know the farther you are in this three-dimensional space from the colored area, more unlikely it is, given some features in the account. And if that's the answer, then is the point that if you're asking a question about divergences or convergences of life period, you're not asking anything because you're not putting any values on the axis, but as long as you have some values, it shouldn't be any problem doing it. It just has different levels of, right? That was the...
Yeah, no, I like that suggestion. Yeah, so one thing that was sort of implied at the start is we're just going to, for the purposes of the question, assume that Ralph got it right when he talked about the dimensions you can capture the shells in. I don't remember the exact dimensions he used. It's things like the distance from the coiling axis, so how far it's going to go out like this, and like speed and things like this. But yeah, so in some contexts we might be able to use distance as a measure of probability, but we should be super careful about doing that because this might represent all the possible shelf space, but it might not represent all the relevant topography of how you evolve in shelf space. So there's lots of modeling results that show that thinking about both evolutionary landscapes and morphospace using low-dimensional landscapes is extremely kind of misleading. Once you go to like high in-dimension landscapes, suddenly everything goes crazy in terms of what bits of the landscape you can get to. So I think in some circumstances, and maybe as a sort of starting point, thinking about distance in a morphospace might be a way to go.
Okay, in this case it might be, but in some other cases it might. Okay, thanks.
I was curious about a sort of slightly intermediate position as far as like the prospects for uses of convergence in arguing for something important about the possibility of certain outcomes. I mean, you posed this, I mean, I think rightfully, the sort of this radical position about like sort of unconditional probabilities of certain morphological outcomes being just sort of really hard to get your mind around just because of, well, who knows how many planets there are and conditions on those planets, and in addition to everything else. So, and then on the other hand, there's this like radically local picture where we're just really finding out about the probabilities with this very rich biological background already at play, like in the mammal case. So what about using convergences particularly when we find them sort of across biological domains, where there's still some common biological background, but there's sort of less, as just a pointer to where we should start constructing dynamic models of evolution that would give us some sort of more interesting probabilistic predictions. So I'm thinking of like the case of anisogamy being one that I know of. So it's sort of that's something where it doesn't, I mean, of course it did require common life properties, DNA and whatnot on Earth, but you know, it still at least came about in radically different events with, lots of differences between the lineages. So that in itself isn't enough, but then now once we see that it's happened all these times in different contexts, then biologists have come up with models to try to explain why it's happened so often. I mean, it isn't just the mere observation that it's happened that drives the inference that it might happen elsewhere in the universe. So with the dynamic model of like saying, of course that's a highly coarse-grained model. It doesn't look at like mutation rates and things like that, but it sort of presumes that certain things can vary, like the size of gametes. And then it sort of says in a large range of background conditions, the same event will emerge. So you can't use that robustness of that modeling result to say that an anisogamy is going to definitely happen, or high probability happen anywhere, somewhere else in the universe. But so this is an intermediate position that says, okay, given that there are other instances of life that have evolved elsewhere in relatively Earth-like conditions, then this is something we're likely to see. Is that sort of too strong of a claim for you, or is that sort of sort of plausible?
Yeah, I think that captures the sort of thing that Powell and Mariscal are trying to get at quite nicely. And I think I agree with everything you said. The point where I kind of get off the boat is, remember, the claim is not supposed to be about any particular trait or any particular sort of property that critters have. It's supposed to be about the property of critters, right? So like, the sort of these theses are not supposed to be about eyes or about what's the term? The term for your case?
Anisogamy.
Anisogamy. Okay. Yeah, it's not. So I do think that we can sort of in a piecemeal way start looking at things like, I mean, I thought in your talk yesterday, I was like, yeah, that's like a beautiful case for thinking about convergences in this way. And maybe like with eyes, I'd be surprised if we were to find complex life in other places, there wasn't something like that turning up. I'm kind of happy with those sorts of claims. But the idea is that doesn't seem to tell me anything about, that might tell me a lot about what robust evolutionary systems are like. And that might help me come around eventually to be able to say something quite general about whether we should expect to see this and under what conditions. But at least directly, I don't really see much of a route for looking at, hey, look, eyes are like this, and some aspects of the way the sex works, it looks like this, to evolution is like this, right? Which is supposed to be what the debate is about.
Well, I mean, the more cases you have, like, the problem isn't for you that you need, like, in order to, you don't want to say, I mean, like, Moore says that maybe human-like organisms are likely, given that life evolved, but, and so that involves like putting together a large package of traits, and that makes things really complex. So just looking at one trait makes things simpler. I mean, I guess there can be different, it seems to me there just can be different questions. I mean, maybe that's what some of the biologists are arguing about, this like very evolution in general, and I don't even know what that is, but like, it's still an interesting relative claim you can make about it being more likely that there are more of these kinds of traits. But, I mean, we shouldn't be constrained by the fact that the biologists are trying to have this.
No, I think, if I may, the biologists, to what extent the biologists care about this is, I think, an interesting sort of question. But I totally agree with you. Like, I think that the mistake when people have thought about things like convergences and macroevolutionary life, particularly in philosophy, is we've all based it in, as I sort of did in my talk, I guess to my discredit, starting with Gould, where Gould is trying to ask this big sexy question, which is kind of, you know, exciting in various ways, but I don't really know what it means to talk about total theoretical morphospace or, you know, the shape of life in some sort of unconstrained way. And I think there's a bunch of super interesting, really rich things to do about cat's teeth and the evolution of sex and so on and so forth. So I think I entirely agree with you. And I think some of the conceptual moves I was trying to make was trying to make it more obvious that there are these lots and lots of these sort of middle ground questions that it looks like convergence can sort of help us with. So I think we agree with each other, and this has helped me articulate what I'm doing better, maybe, but come back to me later if I can.
Okay, Barry?
So if Gould's question was, what kinds of life are possible and what are actual, first I think you need to say something about what it is to be alive, something like Schrodinger's question. And then, pretty much anything that's compatible with the laws of physics will be possible and also actual. Our universe probably isn't ergodic literally, but it's close enough so that if it lasts long enough, pretty much any configuration of particles and fields or whatever space it will appear someplace or other at some time or other. So I think this is not such an interesting question, except for the fun of trying to characterize what life is. Then what Laura was saying seems right. We want to get more specific questions, conditionalize on what kind of life is possible on a planet that's, you know, the size of the Earth and what's happened to the Earth and so on. And I have to wait a long time before I hear answers to those questions anyway. I'm pleased you agree with me. Yeah. I mean, maybe just briefly I'll say something like, I do want to be careful about, a little bit about how I go about characterizing Gould, because actually I've said previously that I think Gould's actually asking a slightly different question than the astrobiology question. So, you know, Gould's specific thought experiment is go back to the Cambrian explosion and restart life there. So the counterfactual is, you know, change things slightly if you want back 500 million years ago, which I think is a profoundly different question than what would a different origin of life be like, right? I think those are, the counterfactuals are super, one's not a counterfactual, for instance, like they're super different questions. But other people tell me that I'm wrong in thinking that, so.
Oh, you don't have a question?
Yeah, I do, but
how much time do we have?
Well, we're 10 minutes over, but we can take two more quickly, maybe.
Okay, two more questions.
Well, I guess it's a follow-up on that question, really. So, I was thinking that generally it would be useful to distinguish between, you know, chemical necessities of life, you know, necessities of traits, but pure, you know, evolutionary necessities, properly speaking, and then maybe cultural necessities. The question is like, is it necessary that the creatures of this particular morphology and so forth can, and living in this particular habitat, form an advanced culture? And then, you know, at the chemical level, you can also ask questions whether life is necessarily composed of, yeah, that's the chemical structure that has on Earth. Will it have a different one?
Yeah, so there's a way that archaeologists and anthropologists talk that I quite like sometimes, where they say they're trying to understand the material conditions of human culture. You might say that one part of this project is understanding the material conditions of evolution. So what role might sort of biochemical thingamybobs play in shaping these sorts of things. I'm kind of, you know, generally agree with that, but I think I do get worried a bit when people focus too much on the sort of chemical constraints. One of the reasons is I think the data from the history of life, I think paleontology really matters, I would think that, but for instance, when you think about the major transitions literature, when people are talking about major evolutionary transitions, typically there's like the original book, they say, we're fine, we've got the laws of evolution and we've got the constraints from the laws of chemistry. And then they make these huge assumptions like change is going to involve these big steps that involve solving cooperation problems. And it's like, well, that's a really interesting abstract question, but it's actually not obvious that that's how these transitions actually occur when you look at the way that big changes happen in the fossil record. So I guess I completely agree that an important part of this project is looking at things like like things like chemistry is the sort of platform upon which evolution has to act. But I do think we need to be very careful at not getting sort of over-focused on the ways in which chemistry constrains things. I think there's a lot of stuff to look at which is more properly speaking biological as well. So agree but no caution.
Last question from Lucas.
I have a question about these morphospaces and the relationship between the actual and the possible and likelihood, and about whether, so this is the actual empirical morphospace at the present. I guess that it's had
it includes fossil taxonomy.
Yeah, but it's had a history, so it might be that at a particular time it was much smaller, and then over time it grows. So I'm wondering to what degree you think these sort of changes over time can be used to make judgments of relative likelihood, or some conditional likelihood. Maybe then you can run models, simulations, where you see how these things... So you might think there's some way of making some relative likelihood judgments using that sort of change over time of the empirical morphospace. So
yeah, that's great. I'm stealing that. You're absolutely right that looking at temporal patterns by both looking at the fossil record and making inferences based on currently living taxa is a really nice way of looking at how patterns come out, and also, it's often a very good way of picking out conditionals, right? You get big radiations after the continents split apart. How interesting! I wonder why that might happen, right? I've never seen someone do a dynamic mapping an actual morphospace onto a theoretical morphospace, but I'm definitely going to go and look and see if anyone's done that, because that's a really cool idea. And you're absolutely right. I think that would be a really, first it would just look cool.
yeah, you make colors.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting is that, if you're someone like Stephen Jay Gould, you're going to think that it's going to start out super full and actually focus in. Right? So some people think that life starts very disparate and then kind of gets very boring as we go ahead, because others think that it gets more complicated as it goes along. So it would also be a fun way of thinking about those different big questions about the shape of life. Yeah, that's super cool. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.